Hello, my name is Lynn Coffin. I'm a poet and a translator, and I wanted to talk to you today about Mohsen Emadi. I'm in the apartment of J. Glenn Evans and his wife Barbara, and we are receiving wonderful hospitality from them. So I received a letter from Mohsen Emadi in the spring of 2011. He knew of my work and myself through my translations of a poet named Jiří Orten, who was a Czech Jew who was killed at the age of 22 in the Holocaust. Mohsen was at work on a project called Report from the Besieged City, a book in 18 languages, the title coming from a poem by Zbigniew Herbert. And this was to document poets' responses to war, and especially the effect of war on the poet's native language. And as I said, it was in 18 languages. It's still being prepared. So I sent in a couple of poems, and that initiated a wonderful correspondence between myself and Mohsen, in which I came to know his work. And eventually in 2013, last year, I went down twice to Mexico City to meet him. The first visit, I also had the privilege of meeting Juan Gelman, who is a very famous Argentine poet living in Mexico City for 25 years until his death this past January. And I know that Juan was Mohsen's great friend and mentor, and it was a very great privilege to meet him. So now I'd like to interview Mohsen a little bit, ask him a few questions, and let him speak for himself. So first off, please tell our listeners a little bit about yourself. Where were you born and raised, educated? What work experiences do you have, and when did you leave Iran?
Thank you, Lynn. I was born in north of Iran, in a region near Caspian Sea. My city had 15 kilometers to Caspian Sea in a foresty region. My family parts were farmers. My father was a teacher and also doing farming. And I studied there. I grew up in a village there, and then we moved to the city, which was capital of that province, Mazandaran. And then I moved to Tehran when I was 18. And in Tehran, I met one of the best poets of our history, recent history, Ahmad Shamlu. And his presence actually gave me the strength to be a poet. And I continued writing poetry. I was writing poetry from my sixth. I was winner of the student competitions of poetry from my 12 till 16. And in my 16, I had a radical change in my life from, from the propaganda or kind of the governmental poetry existing in our country to something which remained underground at the time, kind of the intellectual perspective on poetry. I started reading word poetry and these things until I met my hero of the time, which was Shamlu. And after that, I was studying computer science in Sharif University of Technology. I did my bachelor in computer, and I was working for 13 years as a computer programmer and computer IT manager and this sort of stuff. But in parallel, I was writing poetry. I was doing research on folklore and doing some sort of other research on Persian mysticism and history of them. And also I was politically active from the student movements of Iran in 1999. And we were publishing journals, which mostly our journals were banned after 2-3 issues. And finally, after the GRU movements, even I stayed 2 months more fighting in the streets in Iran. And then I found out that I have two choices: to fight with my death or to fight with my life. And I decided to fight with my life, which means poetry. And I left Iran to Finland in 11 August 2009. I left Iran to Finland. There I studied digital culture, and I did some sort of works and research on electronic literature and electronic poetry. And after Finland, I lived in Prague for a few months working on Orten and Vladimir Holan and Nezval's poetry. Then I left to Spain, wrote some books there, and then I came to Mexico, where I'm living now for 1 year and a half.
So I want to say here that for the listeners that understand Farsi, Persian, they can go to Mohsen Emadi's website, or if you'd like to follow his activities, you can come, in English, you can come to my website, which is lincoffin.com, no space. So when did you start writing? You already covered that. Did the early years of your life have much influence on your life and writing?
The poet you mentioned, Juan Gelman, in his last interview had a very interesting phrase. He says that our native land is our childhood. Actually, my childhood was very rich and in the same time tragic childhood. I lived among wars. When I was born. It was 2 years before the revolution, Islamic Revolution, and after that, it was 2 years after the Islamic Revolution. And after that, it was the start of some sort of the civil wars between the oppositions and the government. And after that, the horrible and tragic war between Iran and Iraq, which lasted 8 years, possibly the longest war of the last century, was a war that we experienced in Iran in different manners. And my childhood was one side full of the war and revolution and rebellions history, and another side it was full of the richness of folklore, culture, and the joy of life as a child in a village life with horses, cows, sheep, and agriculture. And a grandmother which was very influential on my poetry and myself, which she was dancing, singing folk poetry, and sometimes was reciting her own poetry for us. So I think that without that childhood, I could not be a poet that I am now. And it was very influential, not only on my poetry, on some parts of my research work which are related to folklore. And I consider Persian folklore more influential than Persian classic poetry.
Thank you. So Iran has a rich history of artistic traditions in architecture, painting, weaving, calligraphy, and poetry. So who are the big influences on your life? You mentioned Shamdou already, and there's a movie that Mohsen made on Shamdou that can be seen on YouTube. And what about the influences from other writers? Who is your favorite poet, and tell us why?
I think that my best poets of Iran were mostly the folk poets, which were unknown and anonymous poets. Nobody knows who they are. We have some figures in Persian history which they are known as some established poets and well-known poets, but actually never wrote any poetry in their life. This was people who were writing their own poetry and assigning to those great names. For example, one of the works I did in my life was collaborating with Clara Khanes, a Spanish writer, and translating Abu Sa'id Abul Khair, a very well-known mystic Iranian. But according to the research, in his lifetime, he just wrote 2 poems. But in Russian kind of edition of his poetry, you can find more than 1,200 poems assigned to him. I always ask from myself that who wrote those poetry when he didn't write those poetry. So that culture, it speaks about the richness of the culture and the richness of the anonymous people living in the village, living in the rural area, and they were making wonderful poetry. So I think that the first mentor of me in my poetry and my life was folklore and anonymous people. Then if I'm going to name some poets in my history, I can tell that it's Khayyam, which was Omar Khayyam, which was very influential on me. And there is another figure which is important figure for us. It is Hafiz, which somehow We call it the language of absence. And there is another poet, Rumi, which is well known for American society. And there are Nizami, which teach us how to narrate stories, and how to do narration inside poetry. And there are Saadi and many others, In our history, we have a lot of them, and we had to read them first as a student, and then when you love poetry, you cannot stop reading them. But my influentials, the people who were influential on me, is not limited to Iranian society, because after meeting Shamlu, he taught me that poetry does not act locally anymore in the world. So you have to think that to word poetry. And he was one of the people who passionately translated word poetry to Persian, especially Lorca of him is a masterpiece in Persian literature. So after that, I started reading word poetry more intensely and translate word poetry to Persian. Possibly I introduced about 300 word poets to Iranian society for the first time. I translated and worked on the poetry from the East Europe. You know about the Orten, you know about Holland, you know about many others like the Nezwal, Herbert, and Anna Suir, and several, Nikita Stanesco, East European. Then I moved to translate from Finnish poetry while I was living in Finland, and I admire the poetry of the Edith Södergran or Bo Karpelan, Pentti Sarikoski, and many other Finnish poets. And then when I came to Mexico, I started translated passionately Latin American and Spanish poetry, especially the poetry of Cesar Vallejo, Luis Cernuda, Juan Gelman, Antonio Gamoneda, and many of them. So I myself always think to myself that where, who, and where is coming my poetry? Okay, it exists in my body, but my body and my ego have been influenced by all of those figures.
So I should say that these interview questions have been wonderfully prepared for me by J. Glenn Evans. And this next question is, would you read some of your poetry? But I think maybe we'll put that at the end. And okay. So then, what's next for you in writing or in life? So what do you think, what lies ahead for you? What does your future hold for you in poetry or in life?
I don't know. As a poet, I do not plan my future in poetry. I cannot plan it. We believe that poetry is coming from unknown, and it knocks at our door, the door of our souls, and it speaks out. It calls us. I cannot plan when poetry is calling me or naming me. And that's the things that I cannot do on poetry. And the question of life, okay, I have to mention some kind of the proverb from my region. I don't know where I will settle down in my life. I traveled a lot and I lived in several countries, and never I could get rid of this restlessness of my existence. So I think that where my heart is settling down, I will settle down. But still, this heart is restless, moving, searching, and does not have any plan or imagination in those termination. Of course, I have plans to do research because they are some sort of the rational and programmable things. As I am managing an anthology. I want to, that anthology to be one day a kind of the encyclopedia of word poetry in Persian, to transform it to that way. Or I am working on an encyclopedia of Iranian folklore, first done by my master Shamlu, but most of the work remains unpublished. I am planning to finish that works. I am writing some essays on phenomenology of poetry. I am doing some works on folklore, and they are programmable, and I am doing them. But on the main questions of life and poetry, I can remain just silent.
Do poets in today's Iran have much influence on political developments or government policy?
In a political sphere, okay, it's a complicated question. In one side, we have to speak of a cultural impact of poetry on politics, because in our tradition, poetry legitimizes a state or not. A state is legitimate when poetry accepts it, and a state is not legitimate when poetry does not accept it. Irauti says about the fact that how prophets in Iran are competing poets, and it was somehow correct in terms of reading Quran, which has a sutra called Poets, denouncing poets, and trying to tell that Quran is not a book of poetry, while it has a very important impact on Arabic poetry. The same fight that Plato had with poets. So that fight still continues, but in another side, the people, beside in every house in Iran, beside in Muslim families or in Christian families or Jew families of Iran or Zoroastrian families of Iran, you can find the book of Hafiz. So they live together. All the religious parts and the poetry live together. It's very strong. I can say that the Islamic Republic never could find out any way to legitimize itself after a poem of Shamlu to Khomeini, when he says that, hey, stupid guy, I'm not your enemy. In my existence, your existence vanishes. And that's the correct impact of poetry in Iran. But what government is doing is, the Iranian government on one side is very capitalist government. In its structure, it's a capitalist state, and is using, some sort of neoliberal strategies to manipulate what is the canon of poetry and in terms of propaganda and media. So we have still some poets which are very strongly, speaking of in terms of poetry, and we are having a lot of the poets which are collaborator, which are creation of the state. And it's a kind of the chaotic situation these days, which is different from the time that Shamlu was living, and his voice was very strong voice, speaking of a nation's consciousness.
So I have two questions that are done separately here that I'd like to put together. What is the role of poetry in today's society? You sort of answered that. Is the poet a leader or a witness to events in society? And you sort of answered that, but if you have anything additional to say on either of those.
For me, the role of poetry and the function of the poetry is to trace back the historical impact of language to where the objects are first named. And that is to say that when we are speaking of love in our daily life, we know some conception and some categorization, which is known to me historically by the term love. But what poetry is seeking and searching is to go back where the first time the experience of love is happening, to go to the first moments of kiss, when the first time we experience it. That is where it have not been categorized yet, and it have not been symbolized in these terms that it could be solved according to this or that category. So for me, the language in its current state always is a very dangerous phenomenon. It's full of the concept and full of the different interpretations, which according to Rilke makes our life unsecure, and we live unsafe, homeless somehow, according to different interpretations. So for me, poetry is in its proper existence is a radical phenomenon. It's very revolutionary phenomenon. The experience of first kiss for everybody is a revolutionary experience, and poetry is supposed to give us that experience, and also it tells secrets without revealing the secrets. Means that it transfers that secret of the first kiss to you without revealing that secret in terms of concept or describing it or interpreting it in those terms. So it's I think that one part of our development as a human being and many other concepts of us like compassion, like love, like being human, like many things that we thinks to them as beautiful things of being human are creations of poetry. And I think that without poetry we were not a human being in those terms that we understand now, because human is a historical phenomenon and it's a creation. But what played important role in creation of those concepts that we now think to them is poetry. But always those concepts does not stop in their solid states of the language, and they do not stop in the dictionary, and the poem takes a word from the dictionary and return it back to where it must be again and again.
So do you write every day? Do you do much editing? And do you write for a particular audience?
I do not write every day, but I do translate every day somehow. I remember a phrase of the great Ezra Pound speaking to W.S. Merwin when he suggests to Merwin that you have to practice writing. If I remember correctly, it was 75 lines, per day. It was a wise advice. It means that we have to keep working, and but okay, sometimes you cannot write your poetry planning that way. So what I do, almost for years, about 14 years, that I continuously do is do the translation. When I cannot write my own poetry, I do translation of the other poets. Those translation remains on my computer, on my notebooks, and one day I will return to them when I can make them poems. So I keep continually working, but there was other questions that I remember now. I don't remember it.
So the other question was editing. Do you do much editing, and do you write for a particular audience?
Actually, I do not edit much my own poems. They come mostly as their final forms. If I do editing, it's just few words that I may change. Because for me, a poem comes from a vision, and there is a vision there. You see it and you touch it, in your body, in your soul, and then all your experiences in writing and using the language or many other things will help you to translate that vision in terms of the language, to express it, or better to tell, to make an ekphrasis of that vision in a form called poetry. For me, poetry doesn't have language. It speaks with the logic of visions. So I do not do editing mostly on my poetry. But for a particular audience, I think that I do not imagine my audiences. For me, somehow, poetry has a kind of the letter type. It comes like a letter, but letter to whom? To your loved ones, to the people or a people, that in a sudden moments you experience them and you feel them, that close, that you see them in your vision. So I do not imagine that, okay, I'm writing for, this category of the people. If I start categorizing my audience, I am actually starting killing my own poetry by putting myself in conceptual categories existing outside of me.
So 2 questions about Mexico City. Are you able to keep company with other writers? And has living in Mexico City had any influence on your work?
Certainly, when you change the geography, something in your poetry change. For me, it was like that. When I left Iran to Finland, I first experienced the empty spaces, full of snows, most of the time, and those whiteness, which resembling in other types of music, different from the music of the landscape I was living. So my poetry in Finland changed, somehow reflecting to the, your internal landscapes, have some sort of the relation and conversation with your external landscape. And that external landscape was changing the rhythm of my internal landscape. So everywhere I lived changed something in me. But Mexico was wonderful. First time that I arrived there, I was very sad. And I was, the year before that, I was living in 7 cities in 3 countries. So it was kind of the chaotic life. Then I came to Mexico to settle down there. And then it came all the tragedies of your past in front of you when you sit somewhere and tells that, okay, it's my house. And it was very difficult to communicate with the people. But I had wonderful chance of knowing some people who had the same experience I had, as a poet in exile. First of them was Juan Gelman, which I met him in the first month I was there, and a wonderful writer who lived in exile after the military coup called Dirty Wars of Argentine in 1976, living in several countries, and had the same problem. Sometimes he could not write in his exile, and he was trying to describe me and tell me about his personal experience, how he came out to write again, how he came out to keep living, and how he came out to accept, a reality and find the beauty of that reality. And there was people like Eduardo Milan, Uruguayan writer, which I admire him and his poetry, still helping me, and they remains your master. Then on the light of their presence, I start translating Latin American poetry, and I could enter more into their culture and their poetry, and I found that the beauty of the generous culture of Mexico, that it has and its variation and difference, especially among the indigenous people of different parts of them, from the Raramuri language to the Mayan language and many others, which I admire their poetry as well. So it had a lot of impact on me, and it would continue his impact. Still, what I took in myself and from Finland does not left me. It comes to me, it created. I was living in an island, and that island created an island in my soul. And sometimes, just getting too far from everywhere, I go to that island inside myself, which is a Finnish island.
What is the most important thing in your work, or what do you want people to know especially about your work?
I don't know if I don't know how I can answer to that question, because it's like asking from a human being what's importance of you or what's important thing in you. I don't know. For me, the most important thing perhaps is just I am constantly challenging to write a poem. There was of myself. There was a very beautiful phrase of Kohn, the Korean writer, which I admire his poetry, that he says that I don't want to be a poet, I want to be a poem. And that's my goal, and I am trying to find out, very problematically, very challenging, paradoxically, with all the conflicts that any human being can have in his own life, to come through that points to see that how I can be a poem, and everything I write are coming as an effort on that process.
So there are two more questions, but first I'd just like to put a little parenthetical comment in here that for me, Mohsen is a poem, and he's unfailingly kind, and he's unfailingly interested in life in all its specifics. I have yet to introduce a subject that he doesn't know something about and wants to find out more about. And for me, it's been a great blessing in my life and a wonderful exposure to Mohsen the poem. So, what has writing brought to your personal belief or philosophy?
My life history tells about the impact of the poetry, better to tell poetry than writing. Okay, I was born in a religious family. My father and my mother both are very religious, and I grew up in the propaganda period of the Khomeini time in war, and the propaganda was always speaking about religious martyrdom and things like that, and you were supposed to participate in all the religious ceremonies and many things like that. So when I was after my childhood, I think that when you realize, you try to define yourself that I am somebody, you first turn to be religious, and I was completely madly religious person, until my 16. I was writing constantly poetry, but I think that in one poetry festival, which I was participating in the A16, in a bus I met a girl from north of Iran, very pretty girl, which her presence was giving me the chance to discover a phenomenon that I could not ever thought that I could experience it, and it was love. And the night that I felt with first glance that I am in love with her, I wrote a poem, and then tomorrow I wrote that poem to my friends in the festival, and nobody could believe that it's my poetry. In one night, everything in me collapsed, and my beliefs and everything, and it was a kind of the horrible abyss between me as a human being and me as a religious person existing at the time, but I could not consider it, and I could not discover it unless I fall in love. So after that, everything of me changed to be harmonized by poetry, which in center of it was the question of love.
So we have a write-in question here from Barbara. You have traveled a lot. Where would you like to settle down eventually?
Okay. Rilke says one interesting phrase. He says that using Holderlin, I think that he says that the human being inhabits or settle down poetically. But so I told in the last question about the question of the love there, and in my province there is a very interesting proverb speaking about questioning a man that we ask a man that where are you from? I says that I don't know, I'm not still married.
And the last question is there any question you wish I had asked but I didn't?
I think that you ask a lot of questions and with your own poetry, and I try to answer to them with my own poetry. So there is a kind of the constant conversation between us continuing, till we write poetry.
So now I would like to read a little tribute to Mohsen by his friend Francoise Roy, who is a French-Canadian living 19 years in Mexico, a very celebrated poet and translator. I met Iranian writer and translator Mohsen Emadi in September 2013 at a literary festival in the northern Mexican state of Chihuahua. He struck me as a well-read but simple, well-mannered, easygoing, and modest person, personality attributes that do a fair, although deceiving job at hiding his huge talent as a poet and his fiery world vision. Later that night we shared a reading table, and I did not hear him read, but show a video he himself made based on a striking poem about the fate of bicycles when the villagers mounting them are all killed in civil war. It was not his voice on that video clip with the verses of his poems as subtitles, but that of a Spanish female poet. The direct impact of the images in Emadi's heart-wrenching poetry truly captivated the audience. Later that week I heard him read in Persian, and I would be lying if I said I did not shed a tear, although the Mexican reader had not read the Spanish translation of the Farsi original yet. The beauty of foreign sounds, the life commitment I could sense in his work, his masterful use of language, all seeped into his poem, although I had no idea what the words meant. This is about as close as you can get to magic. I am in awe of the lyrical forcefulness of Mohsen's poems. Nobel Prize winner J.M. Coetzee writes in one of his novels, quote, "But in my experience, poetry speaks to you either at first sight or not at all, a flash of revelation and a flash of response," end quote. Like lightning, like falling in love, end quote. Mohsen Emadi is therefore a highly gifted poet because that is exactly what he does to his readers. He strikes them like a bolt of thunder. And I like that combination of imagery, a bolt of thunder. I am familiar with one of his poetry collections in Spanish and English version. It's made of warfare in his homeland, environmental activism, intense and loyal friendships, love. Only someone who has loved intensely can write like that. Exile, banishment, protest against censorship and dogmatism. It's like a word loom made expressly for poetry. Not a peaceful ride through green meadows, that is true. But isn't poetry a born foe of ease, subservience, and self-indulgence? Expect no easy ride if you want to dive into Mohsen Emadi's poetry. Mohsen has a unique way to knit or sew together, without the reader noticing the stitches, grave social and political concerns, together with a very intimate love tale that unfolds over the reader's face like fabric, like a veil through which you feel more than see. Mohsen Emadi's prowess at a craft is which he is capable of squeezing blood from stones, of providing both the kiss and the dagger. So now I guess we're going to read some poems, diving into Mohsen's poetry. And
مرگ وقتی است که دل نمی تپد و ساعت می تپد. عشق وقتی است که دل می تپد و ساعت نمی تپد. شاید همین قیاس ساده می گفت چرا دوباره به ساعت نگاه کردی. می دانستی انتظار تحمل متراکم ابدیت است و عشق اعجاز فانیان ابدیت را شرمسار می کند. اما مرگ منتظر هیچ کس نمی ماند. عصر بلند تابستان بر تابوت ها و برج های ساعت غروب می کرد. ویرانه ها می دانستند و تو نمی دانستی که جنگ انتظار را بی اعتبار می کند و حفظ حیات تمام حقیقت می شود. او مرده بود، بی تو گریخته بود، یا تو دیگر عاشق نبودی. مردگان جواب نمی دادند، زندگان می گریختند و عشق دیگر به نبض ساعت می تپید.
death is when the heart does not beat and the clock beats. Love is when the heart beats and the clock does not beat. Perhaps this simple comparison explains why you glanced at your watch. You knew that waiting is the dense bearing of eternity, and love, the miracle of mortals, makes eternity ashamed, but death does not wait for anybody. The long afternoon of the summer was going down on coffins and clock towers. The ruins knew, and you did not know, that war makes waiting invalid and saving life the whole truth. Was she dead? Had she fled without you? Or were you not in love any more? The dead were not answering. The living were escaping. And love from then on was beating in the heartbeat of a clock.
ما همیشه بیهوده میتابد و جنگ ها بی دلیل آغاز نمی شوند. آن که می رود و آن که می ماند، اما هر دو مغلوب تصادفند. پس اول نگاه کن به چشمهایم، چنان که چمدانهایت را بسته ای، خداحافظی هایت را کرده ای و بی حسرت تنها کیف آخرین سیگار را با خود میبری پیش از حرکت قطار، که حقیقت زاده حسرت است و نمیخواهم حقیقت تو باشم. پس چشمهایت را ببند و مرا ببوس، تا فلز بوسه هایت در رگهایم ذوب شوند و در بی‌تفاوتی ماه قالب ببندند، که قطار به ایستگاه نزدیک می شود، یعنی زیبایی زاده محال است و در بطن یأس ممکن می شود. آنجا که پوستم تخیل خاک است، از لحظه ای که سیگار زیر پاهایت خاموش می شود و تو ابدی می شوی. توقف نورافکنها بر مجسمه ماه بدر در ایستگاه متروک به وقت بمباران.
The moon always shines in vain, and wars don't start without a reason. But the one who goes and the one who remains are both defeated by accident. So look into my eyes as you pack your bags and say your goodbyes. Without regret, you will carry the joy of your last cigarette until the train starts to leave. Because truth is the child of regret, and I don't want to be your truth. So close your eyes and kiss me until the metal of your kisses melts in my veins and gets cast in the indifference of the moon, because the train is approaching the station. That is to say, beauty is the child of impossibility and gets to be possible only in the womb of despair, where my skin is the imagination of the earth at the moment you snub out your cigarette with your feet and you turn eternal. Searchlights halt on the sculpture of the full moon in the abandoned station at the moment of bombardment.
هیچ زنی نتوانست عریانم کند، عیانم کند و در من بپیچد. این صدا از دنجی گم بلند می شود، دکمه های پیرهنم خود به خود باز می شوند، پوستم می لرزد، شهرهای بنا شده بر آن می ریزند، تنم در حالی از غبار محو می شود. پرده ها را می کشم، تلفن را از دو شاخه در می آورم، کف اتاق دراز می کشم، مردم در غبار از تنم می گریزند، با زیر شلواری زیر پیراهن لخت. پوستم شکاف بر می دارد، تنم کوزه های قدیمی را بیرون می ریزد، اسکلت های زنانی که در من دفن شدند، کادوهای تولد، نامه ها، عکس ها. صدا در شکاف های پوستم رسوخ می کند، دیوارهای اتاق نم می دهند، سقف چکه می کند. زنگ در خیس است، در را باز می کنم، راه پله ها خیسند، کفش های تو، صدای تو خیس است. پنجره ها را باز می کنی، خردریزهای کلمات را جارو می کنی، بوسه بوسه شکاف های تنم را هم می آوری، در من می پیچی. صدا از دنجی گم بلند می شود، در آغوشت نمی لرزم. شب است، از خانه رفته ای، ستاره ها از غبارند، عریانیم غبار است. همه شب اتاقم خاموش می شود، روشن می شود.
No woman could make me naked, could reveal me or wrap me up. This voice is coming from a lost corner. The buttons of my shirt open automatically. My skin trembles, and the cities built on it fall, and my body disappears in a cloud of dust. I close the curtains. I unplug the phone. I lie down on the floor, and the people escape in the dust cloud of my body, in pajama bottoms, underpants, naked. My skin cracks, my body exudes antique jars, the skeletons of the women buried in me, birthday presents, letters, photos. This voice penetrates the cracks in my skin. The room's walls are moist, the roof is leaking, the doorbell is wet. I open the door and the stairs are wet. Your shoes, your voice is wet. You open the windows, you sweep the fragments of words, kiss by kiss, you stitch the cracks of my body together, you wrap me up. The voice is rising from a lost corner. I do not shake in your embrace. It's night. You left the house. The stars are made of dust. My nakedness is dust. Every night, my room gets dark, gets light.
نگاه هم کردی و پنجره‌ای در دور دست باز و بسته شد. دست بر تنم کشیدی و خیس شدم از باران پشت پنجره. کنار منی و به هر جنبشت چیزی در فاصله می جنبد و چیزی دیگر را در من تکان می دهد. به سال تبعید تو زاده شدم. در چشمهات زنی عروسک می بافت، به شکل همه مردگانش عروسک می بافت و آنها را می چید پشت پنجره روبروی نگاهم. یکی کلاه مرا بر سر داشت، یکی کفش مرا می پوشید. مرا از فقدانهای او می آفریدند. نگاه هم می کردی و باران هنوز می بارید بر چمدانهای تو، بر کفش و کلاه مردگان. می بوسمت و فقدانهامان را با هم مبادله می کنیم.
You looked at me and a faraway window opened and closed. You stroked me and I got wet from the rain beyond that window. You are here beside me, and with your every movement, something moves in the distance, which makes something move in me. I was born in the year of your exile, standing in the remains of Pompeii's eruption. In your eyes, a woman... I'm going to go back. You looked at me, and a faraway window opened and closed. You stroked me, and I got wet from the rain beyond that window. You are here beside me, and with your every movement, something moves in the distance, which makes something move in me. I was born in the year of your exile. In your eyes, a woman was making dolls. In the shape of all her dead, she was making dolls and was setting them on the windowsill in front of my eyes. One had my hat on his head. Another was wearing my shoes. I was being created from her kisses. You were looking at me, and the rain was still raining. I'm going to go back. One had my hat on his head. Another was wearing my shoes. I was being created from her losses. You were looking at me, and the rain was still raining on your suitcases and the shoes and the hats of the dead. I kiss you, and we exchange losses.
از هر فقدان شبحی زاده می شود. دختری که هرگز نداشتم بر پشت بام گریه می کند. شعری که هرگز ننوشتم کابوس کاغذ می شود. دختری که هرگز نداشتم شعری که هرگز ننوشتم را می خواند و باران می بارد بر پشت بام و می شوید کاغذ را و با خود می برد. کاغذ موضوع فقدان می شود. مثل پوست من که از من غایب است وقتی دستهایت اینجا نیستند.
From every loss a phantasm is born. The daughter that I never had is crying on the rooftop. The poem I never wrote became the nightmare of the paper. The daughter I never had reads the poem I never wrote, and it's raining on the rooftop, and the rain washed the paper and took it away. The paper turned into the subject of loss, like my skin, which is lost to me when your hands are not here.
This poem is dedicated to Delmira Agostini, a Latin American poet, had been murdered when she was 28, and very influential poet in modernist period of Latin American poetry. هیچ کس خاطره ای از تولدش ندارد. هیچ کس از مرگش باز نگشته است. همه چیز را با مرگ و با کلمات می شناسیم. فقط وقتی آنها را در حوالی مرگ دیدند. پشت به پنجره ایستاده ای ستاره در حوالی چشمهایت می تابد. شاید فاصله میان ما بیشتر از عمر همه کلمات باشد. با تو به بستر در می آیم به ما قبل تاریخ کلمات. ستاره قرن هاست که مرده است و نورش واپس این نفس موجودی است که خلأ میان ستارگان را و کلمات را می پیماید. می بوسمت و نمیدانم که طعم بوسه از کدام خلأ از کدام کلمات برگذشته است.
No one remembers his birth. No one has ever returned from the dead. Words and death give meaning to everything. Only meeting those surrounded by death do words become proportionate. You're standing there, your back to the window. A star flickers near your eyes. Maybe the distance between us is longer than the life of all words. I come to bed with you in the prehistory of words. That star died centuries ago. That light is just the last breath traveling through the void between stars, through the void between words. I kiss you, and I don't know through what void, what words, what history the flavor of this kiss has passed.
هر بار که مرد به خواب زن می آمد چیزی از اطرافش محو می شد. یک پنجره دست از مکالمه بر می داشت نامرئی می شد. بازگشت اشیا ممکن نبود. مگر آن که مرد مسیری معکوس طی می کرد تا آن دم که فاصله به جسم بدل می شود و زمان به فضا. در پیرامون مرد همه چیزی نامرئی شد جز خودش. کوشید همه اشیاء گم شده را تخیل کند و فی المثل دیوار را از دستهای زن برو باید، اما در هر چیز از شیعیت چیزی دیگر نشانی می‌یافت. در دیوار پنجره را، در پنجره درختان را، در درختان کاغذ را، در کاغذ خود را. دریافت دیری است که مرده است، خواب به خواب خاطره او را زن از اشیا می‌زدود، به دیگری دل بسته بود.
Each time the man was coming to the dreams of the woman, something was disappearing around him. By stopping the conversation, the window was getting invisible. The return of the objects was impossible unless the man was following a reverse path all the way to the moment when distance turns to mass and time to space. Around the man everything became invisible but himself. He tried to imagine all the lost objects, and for example to steal the wall from the hands of the woman, but in everything he was finding the objectness of another object. In the wall, the window, in the window, the trees, in the trees, the paper, in the paper, himself. He realized that he's been dead for a long time. Dream by dream, the woman was erasing his memories.
یکی گفت نمی آیی، پس بگذار بروم. دیگری گفت از نیامده نمی شود رفت، به نرفته نمی شود آمد. به رگبار ناگهان پرنده‌ای پرید شاخه‌ای شکست، در بستر نیامده و نرفته در هم می پیچیدند.
One said, "You aren't here, so let me go." The other says, "It's not possible to leave the one who isn't here. It's not possible to reach the one who never left." In a sudden rainstorm, a bird flew away and a branch broke. In bed, the one who was never here and the one who never left wrapped around each other, making love. I would like to read in English one thing that was from an interview that Mohsen gave to a Slovak newspaper called Esme, and to see how it's spoken in prose, but it comes out as a prose poem. The question was, what does the word war mean to you? War for me is a city empty of civilians and the hunger of dogs thirsty for blood because they get used to eating the flesh of human remains after bombardment. War for me is a father who does not come home, a ruined primary school. It is the despair of the people trying to help the children buried alive. War is when you are left without a leg, a hand, without eyes, or you are disabled and your wife has left you for another man. When after chemical weapons you need to drink water every minute because you are parched and you are continually coughing. These all are parts of my own memory. War is the establishment of criminals and dictators when they kill all the voices of freedom, all the songs and dancing in your city, when smiling and love are forbidden. It is waiting in lines for milk. It is cheap and ugly clothes, children without dolls, angry fathers, sad mothers.